Hey, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Trent Lobsher with Educational Technology, and with me is.
Kim Culp, Manager of Educational Technology.
And I don't know about you, Kim, man, but I'm feeling like I won the lottery today. So we saw that opening keynote with Thomas C. Murray. He had all that great engagement in our chat. And then you and I get to not only learn with these amazing educators that we have the pleasure of working with day in and day out, but we get to do another session with Tom. And I'm stoked, especially after that intro music. I'm ready to roll. So before we get
Exactly.
going, just some housekeeping stuff. And if you're finding us because you found us on YouTube, you are a longtime subscriber of the of our YouTube channel. That's fantastic. But don't forget to make sure that you're registered for today's conference at technologyconference.palmbeachschools.org. If you don't get registered, you're going to miss out on a ton of the other sessions that we're doing. Some of the really fun swag bag prize giveaways, the leaderboards. We've got more information about our speakers on there, and we're going to update those sessions with some links that the speakers give us. You're also missing the opportunity to network and see some really cool things from exhibitors. So please, if you haven't registered, make sure you do so at technologyconference.palmbeachschools.org. So a couple of things about the chat. We are using the chat box on YouTube to communicate. So if you've got a question, if you've got a comment, there's going to be a lot of engagement. We know Tom is an engaging speaker. He's going to get you roped into doing some things. So make sure that you're using that chat box on the right hand side. That's the chat box in YouTube, not on the platform for now, but in YouTube. And make sure you like and subscribe on to get updates, and whenever we go live, you'll get a notification. And please make sure that you're sharing on social media. You could walk away with some prizes today for using that hashtag PBC TechConf, and also tagging us on Twitter at EdTechPBC. In the chat box, you'll see that our moderators have wrenches next to their names. So moderators, you can say hi, you can wave your little wrench arm around. I don't know, and they'll be there to help you and to interact with you as well. And I think that does it for housekeeping. Also, don't forget that the sessions are going to be recorded. Tom's session will be in VFairs on our platform at technologyconference.palmbeachschools.org for 30 days. So if you miss it, you want to rewatch it, by all means, go back in and you can do so. And I think that's everything. There's so much. It's easy to keep track of, or easy to lose track of things because we got so much great things going. So I think now I'm just going to really hand it off to Kim so we can get this show started by introducing Tom.
All right. And yeah, we definitely want to see the moderators wave your little wrench hand like Trent told you. Yeah. Now, we're having fun today. It's Friday, right? Hey, so we welcome back Thomas C. Murray after he kicked us off this morning with our opening keynote. Such a great session. Just a little bit about Tom. He serves as Director of Innovation for Future Ready Schools in Washington, D.C. He's testified before the U.S. Congress and has worked alongside the White House, U.S. Department of Education, school districts throughout the country, really implementing student-centered personalized learning while helping to lead Future Ready Schools and Digital Learning Day. So actually between this session, just this morning, he was speaking with a congressional panel. So he's bouncing around, fulfilling lots of duties. He's a busy man. He was named 2017 Education Thought Leader of the Year, one of 20 to watch by the NSBA, the Education Policy Person of the Year by Academy of Arts and Sciences 2015. So I encourage you to check out his latest book, Personal Authentic, Designing Learning Experiences that Impact a Lifetime, that was released in 2019. And you can connect with them at thomascmurray.com. With that, we're going to hand it over to Tom. Tom, we're so excited to continue learning with you this morning.
Well, what's up, everybody? And people actually showed back up for me. I guess that's a good sign, or maybe they didn't come to the keynote. I don't know. No, what an honor it is to be back with you. And yeah, Kim just shared. I just in between in the last hour, I had to go meet with members of Congress for certain things, and the whole time I kept thinking of, I just need to get back to my people, because my people are right here at the conference, not down there in DC. I love you all, and I'm like, man, I need to go back with people that get it and people that are like, I don't know, in touch with reality. So anyway, enough of that sidebar conversation. Here's what I need from you. All right. What I need from you, we're going to dive into from research to practice, creating the learning spaces kids need. Now, I want to be clear. What you're not going to hear is like, so just go get your $20,000 grant and you're going to be able to do all this. I'm not coming at it this way. Yes, lots of money have been invested in learning spaces. Yes, great things are happening with all that. But I'm also very realistic as a former teacher, principal. I'm coming at it today, looking at it like, you've got not a penny to be able to spend. My hope and my help is to help you think a little bit differently about the learning space, the space in which learning occurs. We'll help you think a little bit differently about that over the next few minutes. But I'm going to ask for you, as you see on the screen, I saw a lot of hellos in there. Can you also share kind of what your position is, what district or building that you're in, just so everybody else here can also have some context to that. So I'm a fourth grade teacher in this building here in Palm Beach, whatever it might be, just so we can all see that. And I can quickly look through kind of who that audience is as well. And so I'm going to actually run this breakout session, and I've done it virtually. I sure wish we could be in person doing it, but I've done it virtually a whole bunch of times and had a lot of success with it. And it's actually going to be almost kind of flipped on its head a little bit as to what you might expect. As we dive into this notion about learning spaces, here's the thing. I want to be very real, and I hope you got that in the keynote. I try and keep it real. COVID has forced us to do a heck of a lot of things that aren't great from a learning end, and the learning spaces is one key example. Spreading kids out all across classrooms is our reality. Totally get it. Totally understand. For health and safety, it's what we have to do in given times. I totally get that, right? The health and safety goes of you, and the health and safety of your kids goes far above like any of the other aspects of that. What I want to talk us through is really the evidence to practice. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a design activity to get your brain thinking, to see how you see the world. I will also really come at it not as one size fits all approach. What you're not going to walk away with in 45 minutes is, here's your one answer, just do this and you've got it. By the way, anytime you hear that from a presenter, like run the other direction, right? Because every classroom's unique. If you teach 12th grade versus you're a kindergarten teacher versus you're a principal, your lens and the way that you'd come about this are all very different. My job today is to get you to think about the spaces in which you can control or have some control over, number one. Number two, give you some insight into some of the research that's happening. Don't worry, I try not to bore you on that and try and keep it very relevant. Give you some insight into the research behind the why in terms of things that we might do, so you're just very cognizant of it. And then point number three, hopefully walk away with some practical ideas. So here's what I'm going to ask for you. I really wish you all could have your videos on and stuff. I know at a conference like this, it's virtually impossible to be able to do all that and stay things or keep things within the time. Can I ask you, as you go throughout this session, for the great ideas you have, because I know that you have them. You've got experience here. This isn't your first rodeo when we think about a classroom and design and spaces. So share your ideas, share your tools, share your resource. I'm one lens coming at it, got a lot of experience in this area, but I also recognize you do as well. So let's dive in. First few minutes, just kind of big picture, my thoughts, and then we're going to walk you through an activity for about 10 minutes. And then we'll spend the last probably about 25 to 30 minutes looking at some of the research, but also some really practical things you can do in your classroom without spending a dollar, be able to do it. I know there's probably some principals here. I haven't been able to look at the chat yet. Principals or district level folks, you obviously look at a kind of a step up, a little bit more globally. I don't want anybody leaving this session overwhelmed, feeling like, oh my gosh, I've got all this stuff to change. That is not my goal. One of my final questions for you will be, what's one thing that you can implement a change? What's one thing you can try next week? What's one resource or tool you want to dive further in? I don't want to overwhelm you with that. I want to give you some lots of thoughts, ideas, kind of reflect on my own experience to help maybe you process it as well. And 2 books ago, I wrote the book with Eric Scheninger, Learning Transformed, 8 Keys to Designing Learning Experiences, or just combined my last 2 books, 8 Keys to Designing Tomorrow's Schools Today. And part of where I shared with that, we did a lot of research on spaces, because I will say pre-pandemic, the notion of learning spaces really became this hot topic. Like, look at my Pinterest-worthy classroom. That's not what I'm talking about. I will tell you, there's things I see all over social media, like, look how pretty, look how cutesy. And listen, if you're into like that kind of stuff, I get it. But here's the thing. There's no correlation between like pretty and cutesy and learning, right? I told you I'm going to keep it real. So hear me out. Now, I'm not mad if your classroom looks really pretty cute. I'm going to walk you through like what really matters from up here. Not about being pretty for Pinterest. This is about how design impacts the brain and ultimately learning for kids. So I want to be really clear, because pre-pandemic, I started to see a whole lot of that, and honestly, a whole lot of design for possibly the wrong reason. Okay. And I don't say that in any sort of derogatory sense. I just want to really keep it real. So in Learning Transformed, Eric and I really looked at it from how do we make learning spaces more learner-centered? Let me give you obviously what I mean by that. When I talk about learner-centered, how do I make it so? Because I think about the first classroom that I set up, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Tom Murray got probably 35% of the actual space in the classroom. All up front was all about Tom. And I don't know, 29 students got 50% of the classroom, right? Or 45% of the classroom in terms of the space. How do we make the space more learner-centered? And we're going to dive into that in just a little bit. As we walk through here, I want you to take a look at the images that are on the screen. And I want to be really clear. When I ask you to process what's changed in 100 years, in education, everything has changed, from special ed to the rights of our students of color, to the rights of our females. Like, everything has changed. But in terms of the space, when we process the learning space, the classroom space itself, here's what I want you to think about for a moment. What I do each year in about March is I go to Google Images and I type in classrooms of whatever year we're in. So classrooms of 2021, and I pull the first image, you see it on the right. I go 100 years prior and I just type in classrooms of 1921 and I pull the first image in and I put them side by side. Want to see what's fascinating to me? When I superimpose one over the other, that's pretty eye-opening. Now, again, I want to be real. COVID has forced us to do this yet again in many places. Not sure how it's set up in your building. I get it. And again, the health and safety always has to supersede. Totally agree with all of that. But when we process our spaces, the way in which kids learn, we've learned so much about, from a learning science end, especially in the last 5 years, about how the brain and how it processes and how it takes different stimuli. And now if we know that, look at learning sciences, they're fascinating. If we know that, what can we implement in the classroom to really give the brain its peak performance opportunity by the space? Because the space impacts learning. And so when we process these pieces here, here's where it really hit me. To tell you a quick story, I live in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned in the keynote. I was driving out near Gettysburg, incredible area, beautiful, historic. I'm sure some of you have been there. I'm coming back from a conference. I'm hanging up a call. The sun's setting. I pull over. I just need a little bit of a break. Wanted some fresh air. I finish up my call. I'm watching the sunset, and I'm looking over this picturesque cemetery. It wasn't very large. It's just this beautiful cemetery. I was soaking in the moments, like the history, what had happened there. And I have no idea why it hit me the way it did. But as I started to process, if I took that cemetery and I drew it pencil and paper, by the way, grab a pencil and paper if you don't have one nearby. You're going to need it in 2 minutes. And I drew it pencil and paper. And I took the very first classroom that Tom Murray created as a 4th grade teacher, and I drew it pencil and paper. And I put the two side by side. They would have been pretty much identical. You don't believe me? Watch this. Just put the tennis balls on the bottom, put the smart board up front, put the teacher desk up front, put the flag over there, and it's pretty eye-opening, isn't it? Now, hear me out for a minute. Again, I get the COVID stuff. It's our reality. From a research end, evidence shows there's time and place for kids to work quietly and to kids to work independently. We know the importance of reflection. We know the importance of being able to focus and work through things by myself. That's an important piece. Problem becomes, from a classroom design end, if we're also saying problem solving, critical thinking, 4 C's, collaboration, all those pieces, and then the flip side is our students are islands unto themselves for a part of the day. Now, I will say, I know much of this has shifted many times. I know COVID brought it back to us in many different ways. I call it the cemetery effect, right? And sometimes we wonder about engagement or collaboration or why they're struggling if we're not giving them opportunities. And again, I know it's shifted in a lot of places, but if we're real honest with ourselves, but pre-COVID, I was in about 100 schools a year. So I get to see a lot, right? Lots of shift in some places, not so much in others. So I want to process with you for a moment. What we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through an activity for like 6 minutes. And some of you might start to think, so I'm going to get ahead of this. Why are we talking about this stuff? I thought it was just about classroom design. Here's why. So many times in the vast majority of classroom design sessions that I've been a part of, in terms of being part of the audience, it jumps right to things like furniture and setup and all those pieces. To me, that's totally backwards. If we don't lead with learning and skills and experience, we're completely getting the cart before the horse. We're talking furniture before we're talking about learning, and that's backwards. Here's what I need for you in the chat. I want you to answer a question. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or so. I want you to process. It's a question you've all answered 100 times. I know that. So just bang this out. I want you to process when students leave your school or your district, be totally real. What are the skills they need to be successful for in life? You've had that conversation 100 times. Throw it in the chat. Let's get some examples, get some conversations going. Let's talk about what are we preparing kids for? What are the skills that they need? I'll pause for 30 seconds, throw some things in the chat, keep them rolling there, and we'll hit that up real quick. Got 30 seconds. Throw some things in there, go. Give you a moment. And scroll through the chat as they come through. Collaboration, communication, working through adversity, communication, speaking, listening. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Kimberly. Be relentless. Love that, Steve. Problem solving, soft skills. Love that, Sabrina. I hit on a bunch of that this morning, right? Perseverance, social skills, reading, writing, communication, collaboration. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Frank. People skills, keep them rolling. Love. How about it? Clear communication, grit, problem solving. All right. Second question I have for you. Keep those coming if you would. Second question I have for you now is this. I want you to process, and if we had more time, we could spend a lot of time doing this. The skills that you value, the things that you talked about, the things that you see in the chat. If you said problem solving, communication, collaboration, here's what I want you to process for a moment. I'm going to give you a little bit more time for this, maybe a minute and a half. I want you to each answer in the chat. What does the learning experience look like? And I get it. It's not always once and the same. I get it. But write down, share with us a learning experience that builds the type of things that you just talked about. So if you talked about critical thinking, collaboration, self-confidence, problem solving, I'm just looking at all the pieces that you have there. If you take a look at that, what does a learning environment, what does a teaching and learning experience look like to build the type of schools that you're talking about? So go ahead and put that in there if you could. What's the learning experience, that vision for teaching and learning look like to make that happen? So I'll give you a moment to do that. What's your vision for teaching and learning to make that happen? Talk to us about what that looks like for you. What do you envision in that type of learning experience for kids? So I'll give you a moment. Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, Rosa. Give you some time to process. Hey, Frank. Creating safe learning environment where mistakes can be made, shape our learning. Awesome stuff. Thanks, Iris. Quality. Hands-on activities, content area practical, real life application, group work, student ownership, project-based. Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Michael. Seek answers outside the classroom. Thanks, JC. Give you a moment. What do these learning experiences look like that build the skills you just talked about? Taking turns to speak, students listening, being able to critique each other in a respectful way. Great job, Vanessa. Love that. Love that, Andy. Kids helping each other as they work to create a problem solve. Life applications. Love that, Sonia. Sandra, teamwork. Less stress about a grade, more about thinking. Give you another 20 seconds or so. What do the learning experiences look like? Ownership of learning, observing students' need, being able to create activities to develop the missing skills. Love that, Fernando. Give you another 15 seconds or so. What do the learning experiences look like to build the skills that you said you valued? Another 10 seconds or so. Freedom to share student voice. Love that, Margaret. Less stress. Support the teacher and peers. True that, Susan. So here's what I'm going to have you do next. The reason I asked you the skills and the learning experience is that is our starting point for classroom design. Again, if we jump right to the design and we jump right to furniture and we jump right to stuff, we totally missed the boat. It's why this notion of being pretty for Pinterest is front and center quite often when we have this conversation, and it really shouldn't be. So here's the next thing that I want you to do. I told you to grab a pencil, piece of paper. I want you to grab something to draw out for just a moment. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 minutes here. And what I'm going to ask you to do before we get into some of the research and pieces, because I want to see for you how you process. If I could bring you on a stage, I would do that and you could share some things. I know we can't do that in this format or setting, which is okay. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes or so. I want you to physically sketch out on a sheet of paper. Take what you were just saying. Take some of the experiences you said that you believe in, share apart or draw out, physically draw, what would a classroom space look like to empower the types of things that you're talking about. Now, here's my one plea. Keep it realistic. I did this. I had a lot of time one time. I was working with a district team on this, and the teachers were like, well, and here's my classroom bar because we need at the end of a Friday, like, I know, I get it, but that's not realistic. That's a waste of time. So I want you to just think outside the box, keep it realistic. And you're not being handed $1 million here. If you talked about things like problem solving, critical thinking, collaboration, think about your area. What would you do ideally in a classroom to make that happen? Because it's really hard to say collaboration if kids are isolated all day, right? It's been more of a challenge during COVID, hasn't it? I mean, that's our reality. So I'm going to give you about 4 minutes. I know it says 5. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to just process that and actually draw something out. Have some fun with it. If we could do this in teams, we totally would. But I want you to just process. Don't just do what your classroom is set up, or if you're a principal, what your building looks like in that regard. If you said collaboration, you said empathy, you said those kinds of, well, how do you do that in a classroom? What might that look like? We're going to then spend the rest of the session saying, all right, well, what does evidence show? And what are some practical ways we can do this? So I'm leading with learning. I'm leading with the experience from a student end or a student lens. And I'm leading what can we do from that end to actually design it. But I want to recognize your brilliance first. So go ahead and draw something out. I know it says 5 minutes. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. I'm going to give you 4 minutes. I don't expect you to have a complete Picasso drawing in 4 minutes, but just process that. I'm going to go quiet for about 4 minutes. Draw a space that reflects that vision for teaching and learning and the skills you just said that they need. You've got 4 minutes to process that, and then I'll come back. 4 minutes, go. All right, 10 more seconds. Finish up that little Pablo Picasso, if you would. All right. So part of the reason that I wanted to spend 8 minutes having you think through, number one, skills. What are we ultimately trying to do? Number two, what's the experience we're trying to provide? And then number three, how does the space match the experience? Let me put it to you this way. I want you to process the room that you teach in. If you're a teacher, if you're a principal, think about one of your classrooms. If I was a brand new student walking into your classroom for Monday, turn the lights on, there's nobody in it, and I looked around, what would I believe about that teacher's, my new teacher's belief about how teaching and learning occurs? You see, Eric and I wrote in Learning Transformed how redesigning the space is about understanding how design impacts the brain and learning. Again, not about being pretty for Pinterest. So let's talk about some of the research and evidence behind why I see it the way I do. These aren't Tom's thoughts. These comes from research studies, and a lot has been done in the last 5 years or so. Let me hit 3 key areas to get you thinking. The first one that we see in research on classroom design is around this notion around naturalness, and it's how it's our brain as humans have the basic need for light, for air, for safety. And that's around this notion of lighting, sound, temperature, air quality. Now, here's what I can tell you. In the 2 buildings that I taught in, both buildings were 50 years or older, had 0 air conditioning. Now, I'm not in Florida like many of you. I was in Pennsylvania, so it's not as bad on that end. But talk about 50 to 60-year-old buildings. I didn't teach in these brand new buildings that were all set up to be high tech and all that sense. It was hard because I would look at it and say, gee, I don't really have control over lighting. They're on or they're off. The sound, I really can't control that. The temperature, the air quality. And I'm thinking to myself, if I'm looking at it in an older building, like, this is all great, but I don't impact any of that. Let me give you a really practical example. If you take a look at the one on lighting, traditionally, many of the lights, those long, thin lights that are in classrooms, are actually really bad for the brain. Now, if you're stuck with those, here's some ideas, here's some thoughts. And sometimes, maybe if you've even heard, have you ever heard people say, like, man, these lights, they give me migraines? Like, that's a very real thing for some people. Some people, it doesn't impact the way they're kind of wired on that. For others, if they're there too long, they can really feel, especially in times with stress, like those lighting pieces can actually really increase it. That's 100% accurate. But when we look at it, let me give you an example of something we often do in classrooms. One of the things I know what we value is we take student work and we often plaster it all over the place. And I can think about when I was when I was a secondary principal, when I was an elementary principal, we would often plaster work all over the windows. Many times our shades were often down. So here's a tip that doesn't cost $1. From a research end in your classroom, from design, get the shades up, get as much natural daylight into the room. Here's why. Look up any study on the impact of daylight on mood, and we can obviously pretty easily connect mood to learning, right? And so if you look up the impact of daylight on the brain, what's fascinating, you might not be conscious of when we think about it, but you know how it is. You walk into a well-lit space. Heck, you head outside, lots of daylight. How do you feel? Like, sometimes you can physically feel that difference. Now, there's one condition here. We want to get as much daylight into the room as possible with one condition, unless it causes a glare. Because we've all had the experience of it causes a glare. Now it's got a negative impact. So from a tip on this end, yes, I know you might not control the air quality, and maybe there's not a whole lot you can do besides getting the windows and the doors open on that sense, but get as much natural daylight into the room as possible from the naturalness end, and make sure there's not that glare piece. That'll be helpful on one piece there. But here's another one. Have you noticed sometimes people bring in things that are like nature? They'll bring in plants. They'll bring in that kind of stuff. We'll take the kids outside. Your brain responds to things that are more in a natural setting, that are more like nature. There's an impact on things like colors that are like nature, to really dive deep into it. But also sometimes bringing those kinds of things into classrooms can certainly be helpful to create that bit more natural feel. We always have to be careful of things like allergies and not overdoing it by any means. I talked a little bit about that this morning, but this notion of naturalness is really important. So really the underlying question being, how can create an environment that's a bit more kind of like nature in that sense? Let me give you a second one, which is a bit more practical, because I understand looking at the first one, besides maybe getting the airflow that you possibly can. If you're in an old building, some of that really is a challenge, certainly get that. But from a research end, the second piece that we often see in research is around this idea about individualization. In other words, how can we get the individual to feel comfortable in the space? Because we have to recognize individuals are different. It's why you and somebody can be sitting in a space. Some of you love it, some of you don't, because your brains are wired differently, right? Common sense there. We should know that, of course, right? The way our brains respond to stimuli are often very different there as well. And so this notion around choice. So let me give you an example around individualization to be really, really practical. When we think about this notion of individualization, we can also look at it from a race, from a gender end. So let me process and we think about, does the individual feel like they belong in the space? So 2 studies that I'm thinking about, I want to be really clear. I do a lot of equity work nationally. It's almost going to sound like I'm stereotyping in the example, which I fully get. I fully support. Males can fully enjoy things that are typically more female oriented, feels that are stereotypically male, and vice versa there as well. Let me give you an example related to individuals, related to race, related to gender, of things we need to be really conscious of to make sure we're creating inclusive environments. So let me give you an example. Number 1, when I was an elementary principal, I can think of a 1st grade classroom that I would walk in. Female teacher. She was an amazing teacher, by the way. I walk into that classroom. Everything is pink and purple and polka dot and chevron. Now, can males like that stuff? Absolutely. Absolutely. But if I'm a little boy that walks into that space and my notion every day is this kind of makes me feel like my sister's room, and that's the way I look at it, it can impact learning because it's that sense of belonging, kind of like that Maslow 101. You can flip the gender, you can flip the ideal example 100%. Process this for a moment. Really what it comes down to, if you walk into a classroom environment, does the individual feel like they belong in the space? So when you walk into a classroom, if it screams male or screams female, it's probably too much. Why? Because you've got the opposite gender also in there. So that's one case. Let me give you a secondary example. Again, these are research examples that are cited. These are not Tom Murray's ideas in that sense. I'm sharing just some how they're looked at it. Let me give you a secondary example about the individual feeling like they belong in the space. Let's go to high school. Let's look at U.S. History 101. I walk into U.S. History 101. I look around that space. Every image of success around the classroom is a white dead guy. What do our females internalize in terms of what success is in our country? Have females had some significant issues and barriers in our world? Yeah, we better believe it. How about our students of color? Have they had some significant barriers? Yeah, still do in our world, right? And so who do we glorify on our walls? If we were to walk into our classrooms, who do we glorify around our walls? Whose voices are missing? Who's missing in that sense when we look at it? And so we have to be really conscious of who's amplified on our walls, whose voices are seen or heard per se on our walls, who's glorified in what success looks like. As we walk down the hallway, who's glorified? What's that look like? Whose pictures are up? Who's not? And so when we process this notion of individualization, how do we make sure the individual can feel like they belong in the space? Let me give you a quick example from this. Actually, recognize we have 11 minutes, so I'm going to move quick. Let me give you an example from the beginning of last year, a quick news clip. And I want to be really clear. You're going to see something around flexible seating because it gives the individual choice. That was something that said there. If we give them choice. But let's be really clear. Flexible seating can be really good if the management's there and kids have choice and it works. It can also be a classroom management nightmare if we're not careful. I told you I keep it real. So this isn't just about saying, let's give everybody a bouncy ball. No, that would be negligence. All right. So take a moment if we could watch this.
As your kids head back to school, you might notice something a little different in this year's classroom. 7 News reporter Laura Thomas shows you the new way some students are sitting.
How do you win bingo, Jake? In Paula Quinby's classroom at Reedville Elementary School, you will find the traditional desk and chairs, but you'll also see students sitting on, well, anything.
Having all these options is really neat.
Pillows on the floor, seats made of tires, desks for standing, even special stools that swivel and rock.
Well, we know they learn different ways. They also need to be seated different ways to learn their best.
A few years ago, Quinby noticed the need to allow kids to fidget, be comfortable, and feel at home. The freedom to move made a difference. Parents picked up on it too.
They've seen their grades come up. They've seen their focus improve. They come home talking about enjoying school.
When these 4th graders first walked into the classroom, some weren't so sure what to think.
What is all this stuff doing in here? Like, are we going to sit on them? Why is there not chairs?
But they all quickly warmed up to the idea.
I am comfortable, and when I'm comfortable, I learn best. And that's what usually suits me. Sometimes I like standing up when I work, or sometimes I like sitting down in a comfortable little place to read.
All learning in their own way, now seated for success. In Laura Thomas, 7 News.
So taking a look at one example in terms of choice. Now, I want to be really, really clear. That's not appropriate in all spots. The moment we start handing bouncy balls to our band kids and the tuba player, that's just dumb. The moment we create flexible seating in chemistry class with, chemicals that can burn our eyes out, and we want to give them that bouncy ball or that beanbag chair, that's just negligence. Got to be really, really smart with that. We did end the chat, by the way, and I want to give a shout out to our friends that were super excited to join us today. Thanks for joining us and tuning in on a day off. So appreciate that. So anyway, so with that piece, when we talk about shifting pedagogy, it requires shifting spaces as well. So do the spaces in our district match the pedagogy we're looking for? So if we talk about that being more personalized in nature, what does that more personalized space look like? Because of time, I'm actually going to skip this video, but I want to give you access to it so you can look at it. It's really a secondary example, but it's too long to show because of the time that we're at right now. So if you go to YouTube and you look up Elizabeth Forward Remakes Learning, you can see Elizabeth Forward is the school district that's credited on there. Elizabeth Forward Remakes Learning. Take a look at that on YouTube. You can watch that 5-minute video. It's a secondary example of a district in Pennsylvania that's really, they've taken spaces and they're really prioritizing some of the spaces in which kids learn to make sure that they're very active learning in nature. I'm going to skip it because of our time. Let me give you some other thoughts related to spaces. I hit 3 of the key very quickly because of our time. 3 of the key areas from research being individualization, naturalness, and I'm going to hit one more in a little bit. This notion of student voice in the process. One of the things that I made a mistake early on as a classroom teacher is I always felt like I had to do it all for the kids. That was just this notion of I'm the teacher, I do it all, I set it all up. How can we give students that voice in a classroom when it comes to design? Early in the year, when I work with teachers in July or August, I'll often say to them, why not create a spot that's like under construction? If we know that kids seeing themselves on the walls makes that inclusive feeling, why not create a section that we don't design or rip a wall down and let our kids help create it? Let our kids help showcase stuff. Let our kids create things where they can be glorified on their wall so they feel like they're part of that space. Quite often, to be honest, I created things for me, kind of like my likes and my interests. And yes, I'm part of that classroom. Yes, I'm part of that team. Yes, it's okay to put some of those things in there, but I'll be real. Some of the whole thing was about stuff I liked, and it wasn't necessarily what the 4th graders wanted at that point in time. There's this notion out there from a research article around caves, campfires, and watering holes. And let me give you another practical example here. If you think about those things that are kind of outside of our schools, caves, campfires, and watering holes, and you give them just the ability to process what that might be for. Caves are places where people go. It's kind of quiet. It's reserved. How can we in our environments, because I recognize some of us might be coming at this session with, hey, I've got old desks that are massive. They're huge. We have no other place to put them. How can we create a spot, one environment, one spot there where somebody could work quietly, somebody could work independently? Maybe it's a reading nook, maybe it's a corner. That's one example, one idea. If I take this notion of campfires, what happens at a campfire? Quite often we're sitting around a campfire. There's some storytelling. Sometimes maybe one person's kind of telling the story, others are listening. Maybe there's some interaction. And we think about some of those small group spaces. Most of the time at many of our elementary schools, we do this really, really well. We've got that small group space. Maybe it's that horseshoe table with maybe a teacher sitting there, an aide sitting there with 4 or 5 people. What's that do? Now we've got an opportunity for kind of quiet workspace. Now we've got a spot for really small group instruction. We obviously know that's real important. And then certainly appropriate at times for that watering hole idea. No, I'm not talking about happy hour at 5 o'clock on a Friday. What I'm talking about in nature, a watering hole, when you think about it from Africa, is often used as a metaphor and example of how all these different animals, different shapes, sizes, they all come to the same spot to curate around having a drink of water, right? You can picture that from like an Africa example. So in that classroom, that larger group where we come with different needs, right, into one spot, that larger group setting is totally fine. Now, obviously, when we think about the different tasks are going to be more relevant in some of those different settings. But I like that as an analogy to think about where can I do some small group pieces? Where can I do some kind of pieces where people can work alone, work quietly, reflect? And where is it appropriate to do more larger group in that sense? So one of the pieces that I want to process here, and I would ask you because of the chat, I would, if we had some more time, I would ask you to throw in your ideas. That's where we would have done it. But we're going to pause that chat, obviously, is to think about kind of what's that one small step for you? When we think about your environment, your classroom, the resources you have access to, how can we make things more under that naturalness sense? What can we do around individualization? And here's what I would do. Just a quick tip, ask. I will tell you humbly, I don't think I ever asked, and I don't say this out of pride. Trust me, I'm throwing myself under the bus. I'm not sure I ever asked my students, if you became the teacher tomorrow, what would you change in this classroom and why? Are there things in this classroom that, I don't know, throw us off a little bit? Are these things in this classroom that are too distracting in that sense? I actually think I missed a piece because I only hit 2 of the research areas. So let me hit this one right here. I knew I missed a spot. Sorry about that. The third piece, and I know I've got 4 minutes here. The third piece from a research end that we need to be really conscious of is this notion of the appropriate level of stimulation. So I'm looking at a different spot on my screen. Okay. All right. The appropriate level of stimulation. And that's this notion from a learning space end that overstimulation distracts the brain. I mean, we know that, we say that, but walk into some classrooms and it's kind of chaos. Let me give you a practical example. I can think about a classroom when I was a middle school principal. I walk in and listen, it was a great teacher, but I walk in and you've been in this classroom. There's 57 poof balls hanging from the ceiling. Every square inch of space around the entire classroom had something on it. Here's the problem. Some of us may be totally fine in that environment. Some of us can't focus in that environment. When I was writing my last book, because I'm one of those people, when I was writing my last book, I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd always write between like 4 and 7. It was the only hours that I could do it. I'd head downstairs. I'd go sit at my table. When I sat down at my table, if I had the stuff from the night before, if I had like dinner dishes out, mail out, all this stuff around the table, I couldn't sit down and focus and write. Maybe you're like me. I had to push it out of the way. I had to clear it out. I needed a clear space to be able to like focus and write. Some of y'all, maybe you'd look at me like, I wouldn't even notice the dishes or the mail. I don't even, right? Because some people are totally fine with it. Others aren't. The struggle is it's exactly like our classrooms. Some kids can walk into total chaos and be totally fine. Others, it's a struggle. So when we talk about that third piece of research, appropriate level of stimulation, there's no one right answer. Some studies show between 40 and 50% of the overall space should really have nothing on it. And quite often we're space fillers. We fill it all in. And so that 40 to 50% is one rule of thumb of blank space on the walls. So here's kind of the other underlying essential question for you. If it's in the classroom and it's not there for learning, why is it there? So one of the real practical pieces, declutter the space, get rid of the stuff that we don't really need. If it's still there from early September and you're not using it anymore, I was guilty of that at times. Here's our September work, great stuff. Here's our October work. We're starting November stuff. Like nobody's looking at the September stuff anymore. And I don't really have time to take, if it's there, just cluttering the space, get it out, declutter the space and remove it in that sense, if you could. So that appropriate level of stimulation is that third option. Finally, to wrap up here, if I could jump to that kind of last piece in our last minute here, that one small step, I've thrown a whole bunch at you to hopefully think about. Nothing I talked about in that sense costs money. Thinking about your space, how can we increase that individualization piece? Can we ask students, what would we change? What can we declutter? What can we get rid of in the space in that regard? And I get it. If I'm a teacher, the storage is a premium. Totally know how that is. But a lot of times we can probably declutter stuff. Asking students, having student voice. If I'm a principal here, saying to them, hey, what's one spot in our building that causes anxiety? What's one spot in the building you would choose not to work because it's not open, it's not inclusive, you wouldn't want to go there? And let them fix it. Just get out of their way. That student voice really does matter in that sense. I'd love if you guys were able to share some ideas. I know we're not able to in that session. I recognize the brilliance that you do have there. Encourage you to check it out. What's one area, one small step that you can, my friends? You are part of the solution. Recognize you're already doing great things. Hopefully you can walk away with 1 or 2 ideas when you walk back into your classroom, or maybe you're sitting there now, that as you look around, you can say, hey, maybe I'll start over there. Maybe I'll make a change over here. Maybe it's this classroom in my building if I'm a principal over there. I appreciate you all. It was a quick 45 minutes. Thank you so much for having me. Kim, I'll go back over to you.
All right, Tom, thank you for a great session. This is an area I'm actually personally really excited to continue thinking about as we get back to normal. As we review our agenda slide, just looking up ahead, 12:45, we return back after you catch a bite to eat for lunch. So we'll catch you at 12:45. Remember, we're only halfway through our day. We have more than 15 sessions remaining. Make sure to check out our vendor hall for some swag giveaways. If you joined from YouTube, check out our platform. Everything is there, technologyconference.palmbeachschools.org. And from our last slide, if we just, on behalf of the Ed Tech team, thanks so much for being with us today. And as we toss it back to Tom for any final words, we just really appreciate all you've shared with us today. Thank you.
Just a final thanks for all the work that you do each and every day, and make sure to take care of yourself this weekend and rest up. Appreciate y'all.